Hello, dear students. Welcome. I hope that by this time you all would have read A Solitary Human Voice. Today, we'll start the analysis of the testimony A Solitary Human Voice by Svetlana Alexievich. This is the first session of the analysis, and this analysis will carry over in the following sessions. Before we go into the text, let's have a brief overview of what we have studied till now, a brief overview of the text itself. Voices from Chernobyl, The Oral History of a Nuclear Disaster by Svetlana Alexievich is a document about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster that took place in Pripyat, a small town in Ukraine, on April 26, 1986. The book is a collection of testimonies by people who were directly influenced by this disaster, this great nuclear disaster called the Chernobyl disaster. And the book also shows us how the lives of these people were changed forever due to this disaster. Svetlana tries to show the depth of the tragedy by giving examples from the lives of real people who were there at Pripyat when the disaster happened. And she does this in order to expose the human side of the nuclear disaster, the tragedy that befell upon the people of Pripyat and near the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Voices from Chernobyl by Svetlana Alexievich records the testimonies of people directly affected by the disaster. Through their words, we understand that the people were not aware of the dangers of the nuclear disaster. In spite of the fact that there was a nuclear power plant in full proper mechanism, was working in a full-fledged manner, the people around the power plant were not aware of the results, the dangers of the nuclear reactor being there. And in case of a nuclear disaster, they were not aware of the possible outcomes that they might have to suffer. Most of them were not aware that radiations cause great damage to both the living and even the non-living beings. In the previous classes, I had a detailed discussion about how people and animals were affected by the radiation, and also we have seen the pictures of the hospital number 6, where the workers from the Chernobyl disaster were treated. People were treated for radioactivity, and the hospital, the condition of the hospital after the radioactive elements reached there, you have already seen all these. So the people there were not aware of such a damage due to radiation. The results of this ignorance was massive. The impact was greater than anybody could imagine. People had to suffer the impact long after the disaster happened and the fires of the power plant were put off. Even after all those came to an end, people still are suffering the impact. Now, these are all the details we had discussed in earlier sessions. Now, let us get into the text. The prescribed text in your syllabus, that is A Solitary Human Voice, which is the first testimony in Svetlana Alexievich's book, Voices from Chernobyl. I hope that you have watched the videos of the interviews of the real Lyudmila Ignatenko and her mother-in-law, Vasily Ignatenko's mother. The interviews conducted by BBC. The links of the interviews conducted by the BBC, the YouTube links were shared in the previous class. I hope you have watched the videos. And if you have watched the videos, then you will understand how you could see how even after 34 years after the incident happened, the tragedy is still felt by the affected people. People who were directly affected or indirectly, people still have the pain, still undergo the pain of having witnessed the trauma there. Now, in the interview of Ludmila and her mother-in-law, you can see it very clearly. Ludmila's memories about the disaster and whatever followed could be seen as very clear representations. She still he has very clear impressions of what happened at that point of time when the nuclear disaster occurred. She still conveyed the tragedy and the fear of the disaster in the interview. But the most important detail was her deep love for her husband who passed 34 years before. The interview, conducted by BBC, as I had already mentioned in the audio, was taken after HBO had released a series on Chernobyl. The film production company HBO had produced a series on Chernobyl disaster in 2019, and after it was released, BBC went on to meet Ludmila to conduct the interview. In the BBC interview, you might have heard Ludmila say that there were many factual errors in the series and it depicted incorrect details. So that is very important point that Ludmila mentioned in the BBC interview. Ludmila also says that Svetlana Alexievich also had brought in few changes to her testimony. So the solitary human voice, which that you have to study, is actually an edited version, a smaller edited abridged version of the original testimony of Ludmila from the book Voices from Chernobyl, The Oral History of a Nuclear Disaster, the book by Svetlana Alexievich. And Ludmila says that even in the original version that Svetlana has in her book, Svetlana did make few changes. So it's not exactly Ludmila's testimony that we find in the book. Now, Ludmila Ignitenko was a central figure in the HBO series on Chernobyl that were released in 2019. In 2001, a documentary was made on Ludmila Ignitenko by a very famous director, Gunnar Bergher. It is available on YouTube, but sadly, there are no subtitles. Ludmila's testimony is the first testimony in Svetlana's book as well. So, Ludmila is the central character in these three prominent works of art: HBO series, the documentary, and the book by Svetlana Alexievich. Through all these films, documentaries, and books that talk about the nuclear disaster and its effects, Ludmila is presented as the central character. There could be many reasons for that, but what we can understand from a primary analysis is that Ludmila's love that she held towards her husband was one major reason. And also the way she holds on to the memories of her lost husband even today. Even in the BBC interview, which is the latest one that was conducted a year back. And Ludmila was also a worker at the nuclear power plant, and she had a love marriage with Vasily Ignitenko. A solitary human voice, the testimony by Ludmila Ignitenko, helps us readers critically evaluate the Chernobyl disaster. By narrating personal stories, Svetlana Alexievich is successful in communicating the pain and trauma of a whole society that was affected by the disaster. So, by personal stories, Svetlana tries to represent the greater tragedy of a whole society as such. As already mentioned, Ludmila's narration combines her love for her husband with the fear and trauma caused by the Chernobyl disaster. So the testimony contains both love and fear, and this is a very sad combination, isn't it? When you lose somebody and the fear remains, it is a very, very tragic combination. Now, let's have a look at a text. The particular text prescribed the testimony by Lyudmila Ignatenko, titled A Solitary Human Voice. Before getting on to the text, let us analyze the structure of the testimony. In literature, cinema, and other arts, there are certain traditional methods of narration. There are certain conventional methods of narration. The conventional and popular method used while talking about a tragedy is to show how happy the situation was before the tragedy occurred. So there is always a cutoff before the tragedy actually happens. So how was the situation before the tragedy occurred? A solitary human voice also uses the same technique. Lyudmila Ignatenko begins her narration from the happy days before the Chernobyl disaster. Now, as I already mentioned, Lyudmila was also a worker at the nuclear power plant, and she had a love marriage with Vasily Ignatenko. This we came to know from the BBC interview, where Lyudmila talks about how Vasily used to talk to her and tease her before their marriage. So it's from the BBC interview that we are able to understand that they had a love marriage, while Lyudmila was also a worker at the Chernobyl power plant. The happy days of Vasily and Lyudmila after their marriage are mentioned in the first lines of A Solitary Human Voice. Think about this. If they had not loved each other before the disaster, would we have felt the same tragedy so deeply? No. It is because Vasily and Lyudmila were very happily married and they loved each other very much, that we feel the tragedy of separation even 34 years after the incident occurred, isn't it? So this is what I mentioned by saying that usually in tragedy there's a conventional method to show a happy scene before the tragic event occurs. So the happy scene here is the love that Vasily and Lyudmila shared between each other. So the testimony begins the narration in such a manner that the readers are introduced to the happy times and how deeply Lyudmila and Vasily loved each other. In the interview, you all have seen how Lyudmila breaks into tears, how she cries, even today when she talks about her husband. So such was her love for her husband. Think of all the romantic pairs in the stories you have heard or seen, the fiction you have read, the films you have seen. Lyudmila describes her family happy life with Vasily in that tone. They were newly married and had started a life together. In her testimony, Lyudmila mentions how she kept repeating the words, "I love you," to Vasily. Next, Lyudmila moves on in her testimony. She moves on to say that at the point when she used to say these words to Vasily, that she loved him, that "I love you," she was not aware of the depth of her love. She did not know how much she loved him. And this statement of Lyudmila in the testimony, A Solitary Human Voice, Lyudmila actually says this: I didn't know how much, then I didn't know how much I loved him. Now, this statement of Lyudmila prepares the readers for the tragedy that lies ahead in her testimony. So, it is a preparation there for us readers. Now, what Lyudmila meant here was the fact that it's a universal fact that our true emotions, our real emotions, come out when we are in crisis. Only in critical situations, only in difficult situations, do human beings become aware of their true emotions towards themselves, towards their beloved ones, and towards the society. So it is only under pressure that our real nature, our real character comes out. The fairy tale like life of Lyudmila and Vasily Ignatenko is broken by the Chernobyl disaster. Lyudmila's life is a fairy tale gone wrong. In the testimony, Lyudmila mentions about the disaster not after seeing it in real, but by hearing about it. Later, Lyudmila sees the after effect or the disastrous impact of Chernobyl disaster. In some of the excerpts of the testimonies we had read earlier in an earlier class, there was a mention of the very huge fire. But Lyudmila Ignatenko doesn't mention the fire because she had not seen the fire. Not seeing it, not seeing the tragedy actually adds to the impact. If you see something, then you can understand it completely. But if you don't see it, you really do not know what happened. And not knowing something actually is very traumatic, isn't it? But Lyudmila Ignatenko doesn't mention the fire because she has not seen the fire. And she has this tragedy within her. And she was asked by Vasily on the night of the disaster to get back into the room when he was leaving to extinguish the fire at the nuclear power plant. Lyudmila, on the night of the disaster, thought that there was a fire at the power plant, but she didn't imagine it to be serious. Next morning, Lyudmila becomes aware of the tragedy when she witnesses the condition of the workers, including Vasily, her husband. It is only at that point that she becomes aware of the real tragedy, the magnitude of the tragedy that had occurred at the power plant. Lyudmila's testimony is the best introduction, not only to Svetlana's book, Voices from Chernobyl, but also to the Chernobyl nuclear disaster as such. Those of you who haven't read the text, please do read it. We shall continue the remaining of the text in the next session. Thank you.